Now, we have another interesting panel of our conference on debt. We will narrow our scope of vision from the large scale of sovereign debt and corporate debt to the debt that is often something that we all have to contend with, almost all of us. I am not yet insolvent, or I have not had a judgment or execution order against me, but let's welcome amongst us Daniel Prokop from Median. Hello, and Radek Habel from the Open Society, which runs the map of execution decisions, execution orders. Good afternoon, thank you very much for having me. I will speak largely about the local situation, and I will basically build up to what my colleague Habel will speak about later. That will be mainly about insolvency and execution orders and enforcement of execution orders, etc. I will focus on various aspects of vulnerability of the Czech population. I will highlight two interesting aspects, one being regional inequality and inheritance of poverty, inherited poverty. I will also expound on political implications of debt. Now, poverty in the Czech Republic. You all are familiar with the mythical 9%. It has been touted since 2008, or even earlier, 2006. That 9% of the Czech population is at risk of poverty. The percentage seems to be fairly stagnant over the years. And every politician in power and many journalists like Lenka Zlámalová have been citing this number. But 9%, what is it? You can't really use it for any comparative work across Europe. So it's an equalized equivalent income based on the size of the household, meaning that it's about 11,200 is the poverty line in the Czech Republic at the moment. That's if you're a single household. A household of 2 adults and 2 children is about just over 22%. So these figures are based on the Czech median household income. And when you compare median household income across Europe, accounting for purchasing power parity, you see that our poverty threshold, poverty line is in the at about this level. This is the poverty line, household of 2 adults and a child under 14 in purchasing power parity. It's about 2.5 times lower than in countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, which means that a person living on the poverty line in Norway has about 2.5 times higher real income than somebody on the poverty line in the Czech Republic. So basically, this indicator cannot be compared because of the differences in purchasing power parity. It was found that when you take a European purchasing power parity and apply to all the European population, it would be about 20% of all Europeans living on the poverty, living on or under the poverty line. And obviously a large part of the Czech population would be under the poverty line as well. It was recently publicized that this method uses income before deductions, wage deductions, based on enforcement of execution orders. So it basically uses a semi-gross income. I think if you account the wage deductibles, then the percentage would go up by 2-3% for surely. Here in this country, the social welfare system and the pension system would keeps many people 1,000, 2,000 crowns above the poverty line. The system also does not account for wealth and savings, so a Czech pensioner takes about 95% of his income from the pay-as-you-go public pension system, the state pension system, whereas a Swiss pensioner who had been saving, investing for retirement, etc., does not need to rely so much on the state pension. So our system only accounts for regular income, which in our reality means the state pension. Another disadvantage of all these metrics, say for mapa exekucí, the map of execution orders, which is only hard data, is that it uses data from which about 200,000 people who are effectively homeless, they are not accounted as households, or even foreigners who in Prague make up a large or a non-negligible chunk of population, are also discounted. So this research basically captures only a middle group, so the outliers, either in the positive or negative way, are excluded. So the very poor and the very rich are excluded. The inequality in our population, or inequality amongst our population, is much more prolific or present, whereas in other countries the data is drawn from various registers which capture also people who are socially excluded. So the conclusion may be that the inequality is still within well manageable levels, but it's not the case, because when you say that 0.2% of households have recently found themselves below the poverty line, and that it represents a small district town, it can be just an oscillation. So there are many drawbacks to this way of thinking. So the income method is, for many reasons, not particularly. It's interesting, but not very effective. Then there is another income approach to poverty, which uses deprivations. There are several criteria: whether you can pay your rent, whether you can afford to keep your house warm, whether you can afford to eat protein, meat, etc. So heavy material deprivation is 4 out of 9. If you cannot satisfy, it's 4 out of 9. Light deprivation is 2 or 3 out of 9. So we but measuring by this metric, we are quite well appointed in the European context. Only 6.7% people in the Czech Republic suffer from heavy material deprivation. But again, the data does not capture the very poor people. If you accounted for those outliers, those very poor outliers, then it would be the heavy material deprivation would be, I don't know, somewhere around 10%. Many people are hovering just above the poverty line. Many people would report that they would have trouble coping with an unexpected expense of, let's say, 10,000 crowns. Sometimes they fall behind on their rent. So the number of these people has been going down, which is good. But some groups of populations are more at risk than ever. Single mothers and pensioners, so the elderly living alone. In the Czech Republic, poverty has a woman's face. It's quite valid here. So if you're a woman, if you're a single mother, then you have your risk of poverty is much higher. Preschool care, maternity benefits, etc. Are set up in such a way that makes those groups more at risk of poverty, especially when the single mother has more than one child. So this is what we call shallow poverty. But there is also one form of hidden poverty. When you speak about poverty, you often speak about income in the same breath. You talk about the income poverty. And when you talk about income, inflation is often mentioned. Inflation has been steadily very low, around 2 or 1 or 2%, but when you account for the way the inflation is structured, you can see that the real inflation is around 27%. Also, the so-called mandatory expense items have been growing in the Czech Republic at a very fast rate. The rate has been faster than in other countries of Europe, like healthcare-related costs, etc. Non-mandatory expenses like travel, leisure, etc. have been stagnating or even going down. But households are different in the way they spend money, and the poorest 1/10 or 1/5 of the population spends more on the mandatory items than on the other ones. So they are more at risk, even though the overall picture does not suggest that. I mean, when you compare P10 versus P90, and compare the Czech Republic to the United States, the income equality has not been getting worse in general, but when you account or when you look closer at the mandatory expenses, the most frequently the most frequent expenses that families or households have, then the situation is quite different. Even though the income inequality has it's been largely the same, again, it has been rising for the poorest people. The Czech Republic has a relatively low debt to GDP ratio in general. Although it's been rising, it's still relatively low. We are the fourth lowest in Europe, but we have a relatively high debt to GDP for if you take the poor households only. There was... I'm afraid he is not using the microphone to make his point. The research spanned 11 countries of the world, focused on areas at risk of social exclusion. There were Roma as well as non-Roma respondents, so they had a similar sampling. And the researchers examined or looked more closely at the former Roma ghettos or Roma areas. So here, our respondents in the questionnaire, which was the same for all countries, admitted to taking on consumer finance loans. It was difficult to even poll this data in Slovakia or in the Balkans. So here, I'm not saying that the Czechs are proud of this circumstance. It's not about financial literacy levels or education. The difference between those countries is that the Czech respondents mentioned much more often that their loans come from non-banking providers. So penetration from non-banks is much higher in the same population in the Czech Republic. So the providers usually keep the loans at a level that cannot be repaid, and basically it leads to perpetual debt. So there were no differences when it comes to ethnicity of the respondents. The poor Roma and non-Roma respondents reported about the same level of debt to non-banks. So the structure of inflation is one hidden form of poverty, and the excessive indebtedness of the poorest families. You also have regional differences. People in poor regions are much more affected by poverty than people in wealthier regions. The poorest regions is the northwest and the Moravian Silesian region. And these two regions really have many times higher the scale of the problem than other regions. I will skip through the implications of over-indebtedness and debt collection and execution order enforcement, and go to this map which shows inequalities in education. Even though as a country we don't do that badly in the PISA comparative tests, but children or students in the poor regions demonstrated results which are closer to backward countries. Within the context of Europe, it would be Romania or some other countries like in South America, etc. So, which school you go to largely determines your success in tests. The determinant is much more relevant than in other OECD member states. This is a teaser for a research which we'll be presenting in November. We examined unemployment, air quality, life expectancy of men, unavailability of preschool care, secondary education, safety, penetration of the internet, etc., and how these factors correlate with unhappiness of people with the current situation, how often these things drive them to voting for extremist parties, political parties. But obviously those factors cannot be taken with the same weight, so they were assigned different weights. And the quality of life, which is an index of these 12 indicators, shows us a dispersion of dissatisfaction or happiness. So you can see with the quality of where the quality of life was the lowest, the electorate for extremist parties was in excess of 60%, whereas in other other places or locations it was under 40%. And when you account for things like unemployment or long commute, peripherality as we call it, etc., it really plays a huge part in whether those people are politically dissatisfied and they vote accordingly. So this is one of the strongest indicators, in fact. So regional discrepancies. This was the subject of one of our research, and the last thing that I want to bring up here is social mobility.
This research for Czech charity, people 18 to 30 living under their own roof, not with their parents anymore. So this is their first or second housing, and poverty amongst this group. Young people who grew up in families which were not poor have about 3 times higher chance of being well off when they become adults than those who grew up in poor families where the incidence of poverty is quite high. So even though poverty is not hereditary, your chances of being poor are about 3 times higher if you grew up in a poor family. So there is a certain determinant there. So it is a determination, the type of family in which you grew up. Definitely, if it impacts your young adulthood, but what also impacts your social standing is the region in which you live. Your social mobility is definitely very much impacted by where you live. We are amongst the 7 worst OECD countries in the impact on the social and economic status of your family, in the quality of your education. Plus, it's becoming worse in this country. Social environment in which you grow up impacts in this country your education, but also your employment, the quality of your employment, and also your income. Education does play a very important role in this respect. Why? regional differences in education, differences in basic education versus grammar schools, especially grades 6 to 9, and also support given by parents to their children. Schools do not create income differences, but also cause differences in other aspects of life. For example, digital exclusion. People with bad education do not use internet as often, or they don't use it for productive purposes such as looking for information, looking for jobs, looking for education, etc. People who graduated from vocational schools only usually have much lower digital literacy. MLTGI shows that people over 27, amongst people over 27, university graduates have much higher social capital. They've got more friends, better orientation. The higher the education, the higher the social capital. I think that is quite logical, but it all starts with sixth graders, where some kids end up continuing at elementary schools, and some others move to secondary schools where they're more involved, the education is better, and therefore social capital of these children is then higher. Median for Člověk v tísni performed research on media literacy. We don't have any comparison to other countries worldwide, but definitely secondary school students are doing much better off, and it's not about tabloid media as opposed to public media, but it's more about people knowing how social networks work, how Google works, who owns which media, fake news, sponsored news, comments as opposed to news, conspirational webs, fake news webs, etc. Secondary school students are much better in telling what's right and what's wrong when compared to vocational schools. So what happens in this country is that some schools are better than others. Vocational schooling is much worse than secondary schooling. In Germany and in the States primarily, vocational schools and grammar schools, secondary schools, are housed under one roof. At least the initial year, the first 2 years are actually common for everybody. So there are differences because kids get divided very early. And you know what? People with much lower media literacy are much more prone to believing fake news, etc. People with educated parents, well-off parents, are well informed about the past, communism, etc. Then you have families where the background is different. Especially low-income, low-educated families, the common feeling is that under communism everybody was much better off. So more than 50% of vocational school attendees now think that, yes, communism was quite okay. As to voting preferences, for example, during the presidential elections, even elementary school pupils were quite divided over the presidential elections. You know, everybody's talking about financial literacy, but it should be introduced really early, before kids are divided into the less and more fortunate groups. People's education impacts their views, dramatically impacts their views over the benefits of globalization. People who are better off or come from better off families believe in globalization much more than the low-income families. Lower educated people with lower social and cultural capital and lower social capacity prefer authoritarian, totalitarian regimes. They say that they want somebody to have an upper hand, as opposed to those who are better off, who prefer democracy. So those people who come from liberal families are less authoritarian, while the low-income call for more authoritarian regimes. They say that democracy is good for nothing while you don't have anything to eat. People who are not well off, they don't care about the ability to travel, for example. They can't travel anyway because they don't have the money. In a way, there is a segment in the society, members of which feel excluded, and they will vote for parties which are anti-systemic. If we want to improve this situation, we have to look into regions, look into social mobility, lack of education, and the differences which start very early when pupils are divided into the two essential groups, secondary schools versus vocational schools. I think there are people in this society, groups of people who are in high danger or indebtedness, of social problems, and it's very much due to the diversified education. There are many people who don't have access to proper education, and they end up feeling that their chances are limited, and with limited chances they tend to vote for more extreme forces, and it's a vicious circle. So it's a general kind of view I have of this issue, and I will pass over to Radek.